So in 2006, of course, we had both the Wii and the PlayStation 3 released that holiday, with the 360 having released the year prior. And there was a big difference between the Wii and the PlayStation 3 outside of just the power difference, obviously. That was a size difference. The PlayStation 3 is a big system, right? Remember the popular meme of it being a George Foreman grill? That was like the running joke back then for what Sony had created here. But over the years, Sony must have heard this, because they decided to start redesigning the whole system completely, and they came up with, of course, the first PlayStation 3 Slim. And I have to say, it was pretty impressive what they had to do. After talking with several outlets mentioning that they redesigned the entire PlayStation 3 so that it would fit in a smaller form factor, they really did, and I kind of wanted to go over that here with you guys today. Now, some of the biggest differences here would mostly be at just the overall height, but also if you look at length and width wise, it's just an overall smaller system. It's also much quieter, and a lot of that has to do with them lowering the power consumption throughout the years. See, in 2006 when they released this one, they weren't thinking too much about it, or they only had limited parts available to them. But then in 2009, when the PlayStation 3 Slim, the first one, came out, they really went back to the drawing board and took a look at a few things, which did include power consumption and that cell processor. So if you guys enjoy this look at the PlayStation 3 Slim, make sure you guys hit the like button down below and subscribe if you're new here. Now, what's funny about this particular PlayStation 3 Slim, of course, it's a GameStop system. I didn't even order from GameStop. I got it off of eBay, so okay, sure. I can't escape some of these GameStop systems. Anyway, the bottom part has several Phillips head screws that are underneath of these little tabs here, and then up front, we have a couple of T8s that are security bits that we have to remove, and then the lid pops off. We also have our little hard drive here with a ton of dust that came out with it. This is the 120 gigabyte model, which was a bit of an upgrade from what a lot of us had, which was like, we had like the 60, the 80, the 20, but there was a 160 gigabyte fat model. So if you had that going from here, you did lose some space, but you gained a much more efficient system. So I guess it worked out. With that much dust just coming out from the hard drive, I'm a little nervous, but it looks fine for the most part. There's some dust bunnies in the front here, and that tends to happen because that's where the air comes in. And I've seen some pretty nasty systems, so this doesn't look too bad. Now, the first step of the redesign that Sony went with was figuring out a way to flatten the overall system. Because remember, that PlayStation 3, the original one, was called fat for a reason. Everything was stacked on top of each other, and it did make a pretty wide system. In this case, they decided, oh, what if we take everything, flatten it out, and figure out a different way to cool it? So they did. And you can see here, instead of having to stack, for example, the drive on top of the fan, which was underneath of the original PlayStation 3, they have everything here laid out. We have the disk drive, the power supply, the fan, as well as heatsink, all right here. And this is a much better way to cool this system. It's very obvious the way this is working here, where this fan will spin, air will come in the front, and it'll blow through our heatsink, which is here, and then it'll also blow through the power supply, which is a big deal because the original PlayStation 3 was a massive power hog. The power supply inside of it was 380 watts, which was pretty ridiculous. This one is 250 watts, and at the time, the original PS3 was pulling about 200 watts at max, so they ended up going with a very large power supply, I guess just to make sure it was good. They really wanted a lot of headroom, but that power supply would overheat, mostly because it wasn't cooled correctly, not like this. They really relied on a fan that was a good distance away from quite a hefty power supply to cool it, and it just didn't always work out too well, whereas this is directly cooled from our fan. You see the distance there between our heatsink and our fan, and then our power supply, and then the exit is pretty good. A couple of screws in the back here gets our power supply off, and then it just kind of pulls up and out of there. It's also pressed down on some prongs over here as well with the two cables, one that runs to the board, the other one runs out to where you would plug it in here. And from there, we can see our antennas that run down here, both Wi-Fi, and we have our Bluetooth antenna. So they run to the front here. Both antennas just kind of face there. We have our button board right here. That does sit alongside of where our drive is. The drive doesn't take much to get out either. And that's one of the things I really liked about this Slim. The way they designed it and kind of flattened everything, it made working on these, I think, easier because you didn't have to kind of flip the board upside down, do all these different things just to put it back together. Everything was just laid out way, way better for working on or just the overall function of the system. The fan was also way easier to replace too, and at times they would just stop working for whatever reason. But instead of having to go all the way underneath of the system with the old fat PS3, the fan was like right here. You just pick it up just like this, and you'd also be able to clean in here because there is our full heatsink, which we'll take out. But it would make it a lot easier to get any dust bunnies or wall of dust or anything out of there. Or if you just have to replace the fan, it'll just unplug here. You can pop a new one in, and it's just a couple of screws to get it done. Even the board itself isn't held down with much. We have these smaller like black screws like this. You take a few of these out. I think it's like 2 or 3 of these. And then you have the 2 silver screws in the front here where the hard drive bay is. And then the whole thing just picks right up out of the plastic shell. Now with it flipped around, we get a familiar picture of these bracings. We had these same things on the PlayStation 3, the older model, and that was just so it would pull the RSX and the cell processor to their heatsink pads. Remember, they also had heat spreaders on top. They retained this here. They went a little further and did a super slim, quote unquote, which is what people will talk about for the one that has the sliding door. And they ended up removing the heat spreader for the RSX in that one. So if you guys want to see a teardown of that, and I can kind of explain some of the weird things Sony did there to continue cutting costs, let me know in the comments. Okay, with the bottom plate removed, we have the full back of our PlayStation 3 Slim motherboard shown here, and it just kind of picks up and out of there now. So we have some of our thermal compound kind of holding it down on the other side, and when that's released, we can see everything here. Now I want to turn back to our heatsink here for a second. Underneath of here, we have the main block that cools both the RSX and the CPU itself, the cell processor. And the hottest thing in this system is always the cell processor. The cell processor would take so much power and get so hot. That's one of the reasons like the fan would get crazy on some of the older PlayStation 3 systems, was that cell processor. And it was really annoying to have to deal with, because even if you did your best job of trying to cool it, you pop the heat spreader up, you do all of this crazy stuff, you get some of the best thermal compound, it was still not a match for that cell processor. So this is our heatsink, and it is significantly smaller than what's in the PlayStation 3 Fat, the older PlayStation 3 system. You can see, for example, we have our heat pipe here going around. The heat pipes we had to deal with in the original Fat PS3 were super long. Like, we'd like bend them and be careful with them and stuff, make sure it was making contact at the right angle for our RSX chip, for example, and it was a nightmare. This is so much more compact, everything's closer together, and it's more controlled for the fan that sits right here. I mean, look how close the fan sits to our chips, and it is pushing air directly through. So Microsoft went with a pull method. Sony just pushed air completely through our fins down here in our heatsink, and it worked out really, really well for the Slim. And here is our PlayStation 3 motherboard. Now, I mentioned they were stacking things on the original PlayStation 3, and that's why it became so wide. So they did eliminate at least the Wi-Fi board, and they attached it right here. So this is our Wi-Fi chipset. We have our antennas running off. We're on the original PS3, it was its own separate board that would sit at the front, kind of where that curvature would come down on the left side. We would have our Wi-Fi board there, and it was a whole separate thing, had a ribbon cable that had to run around. It was always weird to look at because it seemed strange that it was off on its own, and they rectified that here by placing it directly behind that Blu-ray drive. And you can see both of our chips here, the RSX or the Reality Synthesizer, they have that printed right there. This side is our cell processor. It's also etched on top, but it might be a little harder to see in the camera. We of course know that the RAM pools were split up, so it's 256 here. We can see the chips, and it runs directly to the cell processor, and then the other RAM is on top directly for the RSX chip itself. Now you guys know I'm not going to leave you just hanging with the heat spreaders there. We're going to go ahead and pop them off. I'm going to take the cell chip heat spreader off and then the RSX chip heat spreader off, and we'll talk about some of the changes that Sony made. Now the cell heat spreader is now off. The way I would usually take these off is we would get like these thin pieces of metal. I think they were like exhaust gauges that we would use, and we would shave these down so they were very, very thin and pretty sharp, and that would be small enough for us to kind of slide between the glue here on the side, and it would allow us to delid them. I've never really had an issue with it, and it's pretty much worked every time for me. But look at this, we can see there was a bit of a window for the compound here, and you know, there's a chance this might have got kind of loud at times. This was what we would fight with the originals, where the compound underneath would sort of dry out and there wouldn't be good contact between the cell and the heat spreader. This cell has been shrunken a bit. The original one, if you turn it on and put your finger on top of it or your thumb, it would almost burn you because of how fast it would start to heat up. Now, as for the RSX side and removing that one was a little tricky too, because what they did was there are 4 different RAM chips on there and they glued them down on each corner. So we had to play around with ideas on how to get it off of there, but the best way we could figure out was to heat the heat spreader up enough to where the glue started to loosen, and then we would use some sort of pry tool on the side with a guide on the bottom to protect the chip. There we go. So we have the RSX off now. It actually looks fine. Like usually I wouldn't even have to remove the RSX. It would mostly just be the cell that would be the problem. Because of how hot it would get, it would actually start to like dry out the compound underneath, whereas the RSX was never really a massive problem for it. But there we are, we have that off, and while we're at it, we can point out our 4 different RAM chips here that are on the corners. They still have some of the glue, the kind of glue cement on there, so I would just go around and just kind of scratch that off with like a plastic spudger that's pretty soft, just to get it off there so I can reattach this one, and we'll drop some MX4 on there to help it out. Now with both chips cleaned off, let's talk a bit about what Sony did here in order to make the system more efficient, draw less power, became quieter, smaller, all of that, because it starts mostly with these 2 chips here. Now we have our RSX chip from NVIDIA, and then we have our cell processor that Sony worked in collaboration with like Toshiba, IBM, a bunch of different companies working to produce this thing. And this would be the last time that Sony worked kind of on their own processor, their own hardware technically with that, because they eventually moved to x86 and AMD and all of that with their PlayStation 4. But the cell processor went through a ton of revisions and refinements. It started at 90 nanometers on the original, and then it got shrunken all the way down for this Slim debut at 45 nanometers. They cut the process down that much. Yeah, going from 90 nanometers to 40 nanometers is a massive change, and shrinking it down like that caused the system to pull less power. I mean, they got this thing that pulled less than 100 watts before the PlayStation 3 was retired. That is really impressive to go from a system pulling 200 watts all the way underneath of 100. Now the RSX itself also went through some revisions, and it started at 90 nanometers alongside of the cell, went down to 65. This ended up going all the way down to 28 nanometers with that super slim, which is really impressive. They even threw the heat spreader out the window. We don't even need this anymore. It's down to 28 nanometers. But for this Slim here, this is the first generation Slim, 2001. It was in at 65 nanometers, which is the same as the last fat model PS3, but the cell continued to shrink down to 45 nanometers. Now, that was such a big deal because that was the biggest source of heat, biggest source of power draw, was this processor right here. I mean, the refinements that Sony made over the years of the PlayStation 3 existing is pretty impressive. I mean, just in 3 years, because this came out in 2009, so 3 years after that original PlayStation 3 came out, they managed to cut the cell fabrication in half, and that was a pretty big deal at the time because even around then, just 3 years in, the PS3 Fat, the original one, was running into some fan issues. It was getting pretty loud. Some were failing, yellow lights and all of that. This was such an upgrade, even though it didn't really do much else that was that different, right? It still played the same games, all of that. Smaller form factor, quieter, drew less power. These are all things they pointed to during their press releases. Now they would go on to continue refining specifically the GPU itself. They stopped at 45 nanometers for the cell. That's as far as they took it, probably because they saw the writing on the wall that they weren't going to be using this cell processor beyond this generation, and they probably started to move on in the back half. But that RSX continued to shrink, and that's why the system got quieter and quieter as it went on to that super slim design. This is probably my favorite PlayStation 3 system, however, in terms of the form factor and the design inside of it. And if you get like one of the 3001 PS3s, they're a little later on in the generation than this one was, they continue to shrink down that RSX down to 40 nanometers. So in that, you had a 45 nanometer CPU with a cell processor and a 40 nanometer GPU. That was like, I think, the perfect form factor with the quietest system overall. Anyway, guys, that's gonna do it here for the look at the first generation PlayStation 3 Slim console, the 120 gigabyte that released in 2009. You know what, for a GameStop system, it's not bad. I still have dust everywhere I have to clean up right now. I have to kind of work around kind of scraping this glue off and put it back together, but I wanted to show you guys a look inside of the system as I was kind of taking it apart and talk about some of the cool redesigns that Sony did to make this work. It became way more efficient, but it was clear they were onto the PlayStation 4 in the second half of this generation when they just stopped doing much with the cell, whereas the RSX continued to be refined with NVIDIA. But let me know what you guys thought about this down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.